Hello. This is a long-ass video essay about the once legendary Red Alert series of strategy games and the aesthetic phenomenon I call Commiepunk. We'll also talk about other games that feature a similar communism-inspired visual language like World in Conflict, Battlezone, and Starlancer. So let's begin. In poverty-stricken, post-Soviet, post-perestroika Russian Federation, personal computers were somewhat uncommon. But because of my parents' background in academia, I was lucky enough to be one of the first people in my school to get a PC. I grew up playing strategy games. The real-time strategy genre, in its more or less modern form, was created by Westwood Studios with their 2002 game Dune 2: The Building of a Dynasty, which was based on 1984 movie Dune, which itself is an adaptation of Frank Herbert's cult science fiction novel by the same name. Real-time strategy, or RTS, is a subtype of strategy video games in which the game progresses without players taking turns. More often than not, these titles would also include economic management and base building elements. After Dune 2 came the first Warcraft. In terms of campaign difficulty, the original Warcraft was very hard, borderline impossible to play for a small child. I don't think I've ever managed to finish it. And then there was Command and Conquer.
The Grain Trade Center in Vienna was the 17th urban bombing in 4 weeks, blamed on Nod terrorists.
At least your mother tipped well.
Harsh, unforgiving wilderness.
New Tiberium harvesting methods instituted by the Brotherhood of Nod increase...
The game was released worldwide by Westwood Studios in 1995. The plot is set sometime in the near future, where the Earth becomes contaminated by a mysterious extraterrestrial mineral known as Tiberium. A global war ensues between the UN-formed Global Defense Initiative and the Brotherhood of Nod, a revolutionary cult quasi-state led by enigmatic Cain, which seeks to harness the power of Tiberium. In August 1995, Microsoft released its first consumer-oriented visual operating system, Windows 95. Soon after, a sequel, or rather a prequel, to Command & Conquer hit Russian flea markets, the first game in the Red Alert series. Taking advantage of the new technology, the game was noticeably prettier, supporting higher resolutions. The intro cutscene shows a research lab. The year is 1946. There are two people. We can't see their faces, but we can hear their voices. One of them speaks with an accent, the other is American. The man in the chair is Albert Einstein. The other person is his lab assistant. Einstein is cold, rude, and annoyed. He yells at his assistant in frustration. This room is actually a time machine. Red Alert takes place in an alternate timeline, created when Albert Einstein travels backwards in time, and after having a short conversation with a young man, Einstein kills him with some sort of an electric handshake. The young man was Adolf Hitler. The date was December 20th, 1922. Hitler was just released from Landsberg prison. Upon returning to the present, Einstein's assistant questions him about the success of the mission and the implied impact. Did he manage to successfully prevent World War II from ever taking place? Does this mean the Holocaust is averted? Looking at his watch, Einstein replies, "Time will tell."
Time will tell. Sooner or later, time will tell.
Naturally, the plan backfires dramatically. Without Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union grows powerful under the rule of its dictatorial overlord Joseph Stalin. The USSR seizes land from China and then invades Eastern Europe to achieve Stalin's vision of uniting the entire Eurasian landmass under the Soviet rule.
When you kill one, it is a tragedy.
Over the course of the game's story, Allied forces battle the invading Soviets for control over the European mainland. The player can assume the role of a Soviet commander or of an Allied general. Both narratives are mutually exclusive. The game made extensive use of FMVs, full-motion videos that became a signature feature of the Command & Conquer series. These videos showed actors, some professional, others recruited from among the game's developers at Westwood, explaining the tactical situation to the player before most missions. The Red Alert series greatly relies on the aesthetics of Cold War-era technology. Satellites, spy planes, guard dogs, MiGs, Apache helicopters, submarines, nuclear weapons. The Soviets have much better tanks and aviation, while the Allies excel at subterfuge and have a powerful navy capable of annihilating enemy bases from many screens away. One of the series' most iconic units is the Soviet Mammoth tank. We are going to see many variants and iterations of this unit in various entries of the franchise. Acting on the orders of Joseph Stalin himself, Soviet engineers created the heaviest and most powerful tank in the world. The vehicle is armed with twin 120mm cannons and a pair of missile launchers capable of swiftly dealing with both infantry and aircraft. The tank is very heavily armored and has a limited self-repair capability. Other than its very slow speed and a huge silhouette, it has no weaknesses. There are several real-life Soviet tanks that share some of the Mammoth's features. Object 279 was a Soviet experimental super heavy tank developed at the end of 1959. This special-purpose tank was intended to fight on complicated terrain inaccessible to conventional vehicles and act as a heavy breakthrough tank, if necessary, withstanding even the shockwave of a nuclear explosion. This thing was actually built and it exists in real life. You can see it in a tank museum near Moscow. It looks like an armored communist pancake or a grounded UFO. Another candidate on a role of real-life Mammoth tank are ST-1 and ST-2 heavy tank projects that started development in 1945. ST-1 was supposed to use the heavy IS-4 chassis, but with a much larger and more ergonomic turret, better gun stabilization, more ammunition capacity, and other improvements. ST-2 was a proposed version of the tank that had two cannons, which would supposedly improve its rate of fire. Unfortunately, none of these tanks were equipped with rockets or missiles, which is very un-Mammoth-like. But of course, in the context of World War II, equipping tanks with rockets, while not exactly common, it was an idea multiple nations took a crack at. Calliope Sherman was a variant of the famous American M4 tank with a multiple rocket launcher mounted on top of the turret. There was a version of British Cromwell cruiser tank armed with additional RP-3 rockets. And of course, my personal favorite, the Soviet pre-war RBT-5 light tank, equipped with two 420mm tank torpedoes. 420mm tank torpedoes. Now that is a tank built by gamers for gamers. But the over-designed vehicles weren't the only strange technology in the Red Alert series. In-game, the USSR made extensive use of electricity-based weapons inspired by the inventions of Nikola Tesla. They powered Soviet base defenses, the deadly Tesla coils. The Soviets experimented with the advanced Tesla tanks, sophisticated lightly armored half trucks with an omnidirectional Tesla emitter mounted on top. In the Red Alert universe, the Soviets were also innovators in the field of cybernetics. Several missions in the game's expansion Counter-Strike allow the player to command Volkov, a Soviet cyborg super soldier. He is the greatest commando in Stalin's army and the most powerful unit in the game. And Volkov has a friend, a Soviet cybernetic dog Chitskoy. The German Shepherd is fitted with resistant armor plates and artificial muscles. In contrast, the Allied technological gimmick was less about murder and more about counterintelligence. Developed by Albert Einstein, the Gap Generator is a huge U-shaped magnetic coil that causes interference in the atmosphere that prevents enemy units and command interfaces from mapping or exploring a segment of the battlefield in its proximity. In gameplay terms, it covers a portion of the map with persistent fog of war, so that the enemy cannot see what you're doing. In addition to conventional arsenals, both sides of the conflict possess different superweapons, the American and Soviet versions of Nazi Wunderwaffe. The Allied superweapon is called the Chronosphere. Also developed by Einstein, it's a power-hungry retro science fiction-y looking device that charges the Chrono Shift ability, which allows the player to transport one vehicle to another part of the map instantly.
You waste our time with magic shows.
This is Elba Island. Reconnaissance detected an Allied transport landing. Our agents went there, saw this, shot the videotape, and then nothing. It hadn't moved. We would have caught them. It simply disappeared.
Show me again.
If the player uses the chrono shift to transport naval units on land, they are immediately destroyed. And it doesn't work on infantry. Chrono shift kills all personnel you put inside an APC. Still, the Soviets were visibly impressed when the existence of the weapon was revealed.
I must know what can do this, Nadia. If it is a weapon, I must have it.
It could prove a formidable companion to our Iron Curtain project.
Iron Curtain?
The Iron Curtain is the Soviet superweapon, and it's just as technologically sophisticated. When activated, it surrounds a target with an impenetrable energy field that absorbs all damage.
Oh, yeah, this is it. The Iron Curtain.
The effect only lasts for a few seconds, but it's more than enough to make Soviet tank battalions near unstoppable. Soviet internal politics are portrayed as Byzantine. Stalin is a Nazi-esque villain who is gassing Eastern European villages and gloating over pictures of dead civilians. This game is not tanky-friendly. Occasionally, during mission briefings, a mysterious bald man would walk up to Stalin and whisper something in his ear. This is Kane, the seemingly immortal leader of the Brotherhood of Nod, the antagonist of the main Command & Conquer series. Another key character, Nadia Zelenkova, is in charge of the NKVD secret police. She's a ruthless woman who is Stalin's personal aide and lover. She is also a secret agent of the Brotherhood of Nod and answers directly to Kane, not to Stalin.
Some things you are not cleared to see.
At one point, she kills a rival Soviet officer Radik Gradenko with poison tea. "That's some good tea," he says. "I know," replies Nadia. "I made it myself." Gradenko is replaced by Georgy Kukov, who eventually gets executed as well. Operation to capture the chronosphere fails due to Kukov's faulty intelligence. Stalin gets furious and strangles him, breaking his neck in the process.
I am surrounded by idiots.
The game's score was composed by Frank Klepacki. His most recognizable work is the main theme of Red Alert, titled Hell March. The rhythms of Hell March bear a certain, although admittedly very superficial, similarity to Saint War, a classic Soviet military song, both inspirational and tragic, conjuring images of people marching to the front. This is almost certainly unintentional, but nevertheless very emotionally resonating. In the Soviet ending, the communist leaders celebrate victory in the newly liberated Buckingham Palace. Stalin commands the player, but is suddenly poisoned by his closest advisor, Nadia. "You should never drink anything Nadia gives you. That's an amateur mistake, Mr. Stalin." She then proceeds to shoot him repeatedly. Stalin dies, and Nadia tells the player that the Brotherhood of Nod have a plan to return to the shadows again and re-emerge in the 90s, leaving the player as the puppet ruler of the USSR, ready to do the Brotherhood's bidding for the foreseeable future. I'm not sure, but I think this implies that Nod did perestroika. But suddenly Nadia herself is betrayed. For some reason, she is shot in the back by Kane, the leader of the Brotherhood of Nod, who reveals himself to be the true mastermind behind the game's events. Unfortunately, this hilarious ending is not canonical. The Allied one is. The Allied command uses the chronosphere to teleport a fleet of ships to Volga River. Following the siege of Moscow, an Allied soldier discovers Stalin buried in the rubble of the Kremlin. He is still alive.
Jeez Louise! It's Stalin!
Before they begin to remove the debris from the fallen leader, Allied General Stavros stops them. He says that they saw nothing and orders them to leave. Stavros then stuffs a handkerchief down Stalin's mouth before covering his head with a large stone and walking away. Not quite as delightfully insane as the Soviet ending, but appropriately morbid.
Mr. President, it's General Marvell at the Pentagon on line 5.
This is Dugan.
Mr. President, I'm afraid we have a heck of a situation down here.
How bad could it be, Ben?
Red Alert 2 was released in October 23rd, the year 2000, and just like all main games in the Command & Conquer series so far, it was a commercial and critical success. The most noticeable thing about the sequel is the change of its visual style and the overall tone. The first game was grounded in realism. It took the existing World War II and Cold War aesthetics and tropes and added a light science fiction element to them. Red Alert 2 visual style could be described as a satirical hyperbole. There used to be this misconception among Red Alert fans, back when there used to be Red Alert fans, that the series was always satire, but this is simply not true.
One of our spies has confirmed our worst fears. The Russians have developed a weapon greater than anything previously known. An atomic bomb.
Just like with the Fallout franchise, all the craziest elements originated in the sequel. Red Alert 2 continues the story from the first game. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, attempted to conquer Europe, but was ultimately defeated by the Allied nations and their military was destroyed. Fearing that a regime change would cause mass unrest in the USSR, the victorious Allies installed Alexander Romanov, a distant relative of the deposed Tsar Nicholas II, as the puppet Soviet premier.
We Romanovs have our legacy to consider.
And Romanov acquiesces to the Allies' demands at first, but he has a secret agenda. He builds up the Soviet military for defense purposes, a cover for the intended invasion of the United States. The game's storyline starts off in 1972 with the US armed forces caught completely off guard by the sudden massive Soviet invasion from all directions, with Soviet aircraft, naval vessels, amphibious forces and paratroopers coming in on both East Coast and West Coast, and with the majority of Soviet ground forces invading through the communist-aligned Mexico. The US attempts to retaliate with the nuclear missiles, but the Reds are several steps ahead. Yuri, the leader of the Soviet Psy Corps and Premier Romanov's right-hand man, uses his mind control powers to manipulate the personnel in charge with launching the warheads, preventing the nuclear retaliation.
Missile Command.
10 seconds to launch. Open the missile silos.
Within hours, the US is overrun with Soviet troops. Once again, you can play as either the Soviets or the Allies. Following the September 11 attacks, the game's cover art was redesigned to remove the depiction of a plane heading towards a burning World Trade Center. The US flag on the front cover was replaced with a mushroom cloud. In the Operation Big Apple, the game's third mission for the Soviet side, the commander is tasked with capturing
the pathetic capitalist shrine in New York called the World Trade Center.
After garrisoning the Twin Towers with conscripts, the Soviets construct a device called the Psychic Beacon. When it comes online, the whole population of New York is brainwashed. An entire American armored division was captured before it was able to escape the beacon's mind control radius. American civilians are now eager to join the Red Army en masse.
And in short order, we will all, young and old, pledge allegiance to our new leader, Premier Romanov of the USSR.
What the game developers didn't know back then, and what we know now, is that you don't need a psychic beacon to do that. That's what podcasts are for. The sequel was even more weird and creative with its units than the original game, which is saying a lot. The Soviet Desolator is a potent anti-infantry unit equipped with a nuclear battlesuit and a rad cannon. The old Soviet twin-barreled Mammoth tank has a worthy successor. Visually, the Apocalypse Assault Tank looks like a larger version of a famous T34, but with a much bigger turret, two 120mm cannons, and a pair of missile launchers capable of engaging air targets. It's the most powerful vehicle in the game, although American Prism tanks are arguably more effective when used in large numbers. In the final mission of the Allied campaign, the Americans use the Chronosphere to teleport a strike force directly to Moscow. After overcoming fierce resistance, the player defeats Premier Romanov's personal elite unit, the Black Guard, who defend the Kremlin with their Apocalypse assault tanks, all painted black. The Premier is subsequently captured by the Allies, and the war is over.
After months of brutal fighting, Allied forces have captured Soviet Premier Romanov and his Kremlin command post late this afternoon in a dizzying show of high technology and good old military discipline.
The Soviets can train demolition experts called Crazy Ivans. In the mid-game cutscene for the Allied side, one of them acts as a suicide bomber.
No rest for the wicked, Commander. We're both being shipped to Germany. I'm going to Berlin, where we're planning our final thrust. Einstein is our ace in the hole. We can't afford to lose him. Auf Wiedersehen.
In its multiplayer and skirmish modes, Red Alert 2 allows the player to pick a sub-faction, an individual nation that is either a part of the Allies or the game's version of Comintern. Different sub-factions can have unique units or buildings. For example, the Republic of Korea, which in the Red Alert universe is a united country on the Allied side, has a powerful VTOL fighter bombers called the Black Eagles. France is capable of constructing grand cannons, gigantic static guns firing at long range for massive damage. A single hit is usually enough to kill any lightly armored unit. Germany, which is also a united nation in this timeline, fields powerful long-barrel tank destroyers, although these still lose to the Apocalypse tanks in one-on-one engagements. So what about the Soviet-aligned nations? One of the playable countries of the World Socialist Alliance is Cuba. What is the Cuban unique unit? It's a terrorist. Just a terrorist. A guy with Cuban accent and a bomb who walks up to an enemy unit or a building and blows himself up, causing a moderate amount of damage. The Cuban terrorist is a fanatic for the Soviet cause, the multiplayer loading screen tells us. That's a little insensitive to Cuban culture. Another Soviet-aligned nation is Libya. And what is their unique unit or building? It's a suicide truck, a car bomb. Today, these are usually referred to as Suicide Vehicle-Borne Improvised Explosive Devices, or SVBIEDs. Such vehicles are some of the most deadly weapons in the arsenal of real-life terrorist organizations like ISIS. This game has too many fucking suicide bombers. When the Soviet Union lost the war after the events of the first Red Alert, it was forbidden from building up an air force. Unconventional Kirov airships, massive heavily armored bomber Zeppelins, were the Soviet attempt to circumvent the sanctions. These slow-moving flying juggernauts are capable of carrying gigantic payloads of bombs that can destroy any enemy structure with just one or two hits. Kirov became one of the series' signature units. The second iteration of the Tesla tank is a fully tracked chassis with two small turret-mounted Tesla coils. The mobile Tesla gun has less range and power compared to its stationary counterpart. However, the lightning bolts arc over walls as well as other obstacles and are very effective at killing infantry. Psy-Corps is a branch within the Soviet military that specializes in psychic warfare. The unit was first formed under the direction of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator realized that gifted individuals who possessed telepathic talent could be of use to the Soviet war effort and recruited them to the newly formed Corps.
This is Stalin's psychic legacy.
The telepaths were trained rigorously to extend the power of their minds to their limits. The project was shrouded in secrecy, but eventually it led to practical mind control over the battlefield. Each member of the Corps had a tattoo on the forehead with a unique glyph, including 3 Hebrew letters, Resh, Vav, and Yod, spelling Yur when read left to right. Wait, what am I looking at exactly? Is this a far-right dog whistle? Are these the actual mind-controlling Judeo-Bolsheviks? Am I getting red-pilled? Are you trying to say something, you Red Alert? Almost certainly not. The game was made long before the Nazi Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy was popularized by the alt-right. Obama's election and the subsequent proliferation of far-right militias was still years away. The authentic American Nazi movement that terrorized the nation in the 60s and 70s was inactive for some time now. When Red Alert 2 was released, there was no coherent far-right culture to dog whistle to. The game was made in a historical period when the United States briefly didn't have a designated enemy. No one to focus hatred on. Many video games, movies, and TV shows made in the 90s had this problem. The Cold War was over. You can still oppose communists or the Soviets, but you need to do it sort of ironically. 9/11 was about to happen. Muslims would then become the focus of aggression. And in a few years after that, in a little less than a decade, we'll witness the phenomenon that I call the bleeding heart race science. It can be observed in Call of Duty games, specifically in Modern Warfare entries. The designers, who are statistically likely to have liberal beliefs, did this ethno-racial triangulation in an attempt to combine various features from different nations and ethnicities to create what is essentially a racial and cultural caricature optimized by its hateability. The end result would be a creature that is part Russian, part Middle Eastern, with some facial features of a person originating from the Caucasus Mountains, part communist, part nationalist. But the Red Alert series was better than that. Mark Johnson, an independent game developer as well as game studies academic, described the game's aesthetic like this. Red Alert 2 lies somewhere in the intersection between dieselpunk, raygun gothic, and retrofuturism. Retrofuturism focuses on the depictions of past futures, which is to say the visions of the future which have since failed to come to pass, whilst raygun gothic, a subset of retrofuturism, is a depiction of a particular alternative future extrapolated from modernist aesthetics and often used interchangeably with retrofuturism, sometimes associated with the Fallout series, particularly its most recent iterations. Fallout aesthetic can be described as atom punk. I propose that by analogy, the aesthetic of Red Alert, or at least its Soviet theme, should be called Commiepunk. Now, in Western popular culture, communism and the Soviet Union are portrayed in various ways using a number of different styles. Most of them are not Commiepunk, which is different from the garden variety Tom Clancy-esque boomer shit in a number of ways. For one, it's often hyperbolic, includes elements of comedy and satire. It's hauntological, it heavily relies on the aesthetics of the Soviet technology. It exaggerates paranoia and conflict, but it's less serious and more playful with these elements. And it originated in the American imagination. Commiepunk is in fact an authentically American style that has little to do with the real-life USSR, Soviet culture, or Russian realities, save for the superficial visual resemblance of its aesthetic. And in the expansion to Red Alert 2, the series absolutely overdosed on Commiepunk. Developed by Westwood Pacific, Command & Conquer Yuri's Revenge was released in North America on October 10th, 2001. According to Metacritic, the reviews were overwhelmingly positive. To this day, people still make mods for this game. The story starts off assuming that the Allies were victorious in the previous campaign. However, neither Yuri's Revenge nor the main game are considered to be canon within the core Command & Conquer universe. Even the canonicity of the first Red Alert is questionable, with Kane controlling Stalin and all that. The expansion begins with the White House announcing DEFCON 2 status as Yuri, the former head of Soviet Psy-Corps, reveals his plan to take over the world through mind control. This would be accomplished by activating a network of psychic dominators he had secretly constructed around the world.
Yuri, the war's over. Can't we all just get along?
The US launches an airstrike on the Psychic Dominator on Alcatraz Island, but it's well protected by static anti-air defenses. Luckily, the airstrike damaged Yuri's nuclear power plant, rendering the device inert. The Allies used the window of opportunity to draw up a plan to travel back in time to stop Yuri's scheme before it happens. Like always, there are two campaigns, the Allied one and the Soviet one. The Soviet intelligence, headed by Lieutenant Zofia, discovered the Allied plan, and Premier Romanov secretly communicated from his jail cell in the Tower of London, ordered the Red Army to seize the time machine and use it to change the outcome of the war. A special Soviet task force led by Zofia and elite commando Boris was thus sent to San Francisco with orders to capture the time machine. With them, they carried important intelligence documents to be delivered to Premier Romanov's past self. But something goes wrong. Too much power is fed into the machine, making it overshoot the intended destination. The Soviet armored strike force is taken to the Cretaceous era. The conscripts and tanks have to fight off dinosaurs while they wait for the machine to recharge itself. Make a mental note of this, it's going to become an important plot point later. Eventually, the Soviets arrived at San Francisco during the events of Red Alert 2. The city is still under the Soviet occupation. They destroy Yuri's Psychic Dominator while it's still incomplete and harmless. To prevent a future in which the Soviet Union loses the war to the Allies, the Soviet commander is put in charge of the assault on the Allied Chronosphere prototype in the Black Forest, Germany.
Allies will win war by using sneaky device called Chronosphere to invade Moscow.
Without the superweapon, the Allied military effort is doomed. The Soviet Union becomes the de facto world superpower and focuses on destroying the renegade Psychor. The commander is then deployed to an uncharted island in the Pacific Ocean, where Yuri has set up a large base. The base is revealed to be a launch facility hosting a spacecraft program to fly to the moon, which Yuri intends to use as a refuge when the Psychic Dominator network goes online.
Well done, Comrade General. We have analyzed flight plan of this rocket ship. It is programmed to fly to the moon. We must find out why. You have cosmonaut training, yes?
The Soviets use this rocket to send a specialized cosmonaut task force to the moon to find Yuri and bring him to justice. The moon mission is fucking rad. Soviet cosmonauts with jetpacks and laser cannons, along with the Apocalypse tanks, which as it turns out can function just fine in space, do battle against Psychor flying saucers and the armored vehicles called masterminds, essentially huge brains on tracks protected by armor plates. These are able to control up to 3 enemy units at the same time.
Congratulations, Comrade General! Or should I say, Cosmonaut General!
Yuri is discovered in his ancestral home of Transylvania, where he has combined his own forces with mind-controlled Allied and Soviet troops around his stronghold. The final battle commences. Despite the strength of his defenses, the Soviet commander defeats the Psychor and destroys Yuri's castle. In a last-ditch effort, Yuri activates the time machine which he has stolen from San Francisco.
The entire world and all of its history is mine to command and conquer.
However, Lieutenant Sophia hacks the time machine, causing Yuri to travel to the early Cretaceous period with depleted power reserves. Stranded in time, Yuri is eaten by Tyrannosaurus Rex. See? Something that was set up earlier in the story paid off in the end. With its enemies crushed and defeated, the Soviet Union imposed communism over the entire world. The Reds begin to build their space program, ready to spread their cause to the far reaches of space. The Soviet Star Empire. This ending is not canonical. Red Alert 2 has an impressive roster of available units, and just as impressive was the list of units that did not make it into the final game. Some of these are reconstructed in mods, but most exist only as concept art. Like this steampunkish-looking Soviet transport Zeppelin that was supposed to serve as a mobile airfield for Kirov-class airships, twin-rotor assault helicopters, and Hind transport choppers that were also cut. The Seismic Tank is a vehicle cut from Yuri's Revenge. It was supposed to create massive earthquakes to damage everything in its wake. Another version of this vehicle had a giant sonic cannon instead of a hammer. Soviet Personal Transport Walker is a 4-legged transport vehicle that underwent several design iterations before finally being scrapped. Some of these look similar to Nazi Predator robots from the reborn Wolfenstein series. The Hammerhead Artillery is a massive armored land vehicle with a double set of tracks that just looks cool as hell. Soviet Twin Airship is a heavy oversized Zeppelin with twin balloons between which 2 thrust turbines are located. This thing looks like something designed by the Brotherhood of Steel from the Fallout series. And speaking of things that look like they were inspired by Fallout, the twin-rotor assault chopper is a helicopter that was supposed to function as the Soviet Union's primary gunship, but it was cut from the final version. It looks pretty much exactly like an Enclave vertibird from Fallout 2. Another cut feature is something called Turtle Mode. According to available concept art, certain Soviet structures were supposed to be able to enter this specialized defensive mode, increasing their resiliency, but disabling the structure's production capabilities. For example, the Soviet Tesla reactor would cover its core with a protective steel shield, while the statue of a trooper that can be seen on top of the Soviet barracks would be lowered and hidden inside the structure. Sounds like one of these high-concept ideas that look good on paper but don't actually change the gameplay in any meaningful way. The term hauntology first appeared in 1993 book Spectres of Marx by French philosopher Jacques Derrida. He argued that Marxism would haunt the West from beyond the grave. The word itself is a linguistic blend of haunting and ontology. The latter is the philosophy of being. The concept became associated with Mark Fisher and his book Ghosts of My Life, which, unlike Derrida's work, is considered to be very readable even by mere mortals who do not possess an understanding of the language used in academic philosophy. Hauntology is broadly the notion that the present is haunted by lost futures that never came to pass. It inspires many fields of investigation, from the visual arts to philosophy, music, fiction, and literary criticism. When Red Alert 2 was released, I was still a child. Command & Conquer series was very popular among the kids in our neighborhood, so naturally after trying out the game, we gathered outside to discuss our impressions. One of my friends shared a story of his father, a very well-educated engineer, who literally cried tears of joy during the final minutes of the first Soviet mission, when section by section a horde of Soviet conscripts destroys the Pentagon. From a certain point of view, the Red Alert series can be a deeply hauntological experience. KGB spies stealing atomic secrets, experimental tanks, super weapons, the space race, deciding the fate of the world, echoes of the former glory. In Red Alert 2, through the American-installed Soviet Premier Romanov, we're being haunted by the ghost of the Russian Empire. Even the Soviet bases in that game had this strange mix of communist industrial and orthodox aesthetic. Red Alert is satire, not something you're supposed to take seriously, but from a Russian point of view, it's impossible not to see a future that was stolen. What would have happened if the Soviet tragedies were prevented? If the tragic loss of life during the Civil War, the Holodomor and other famines, the Great Patriotic War, and the gulags could have been avoided, or at least sufficiently minimized, then the survivors would have had children, and their children would have had their own kids. There are attempts to quantify the difference. According to one study, if all the tragedies could have been avoided, Russia would have had around 400 million people. How would this lost culture even look like? It's hard to tell. It was destroyed so thoroughly that it no longer exists even inside the imagination. The next game in the series, Command & Conquer Generals, was its 7th installment.
Senseless American aggression once more fills the sky.
Our premier again denied involvement.
The military had the fragmented Global Liberation Army on the run.
Generals was the first in the Command & Conquer series that not only strayed away from the original GDI versus Nord war, but also the Soviet versus Allies storyline of the Red Alert universe. The game's 3 factions are the USA, China, and the Global Liberation Army, or GLA, which was a Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and North African faction. Essentially, it represents the Islamic world, but the game never states that outright. The game's intro cutscene does something out of ordinary, featuring real-life politicians who were relevant at the time. George W. Bush, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. The same cutscene shows various advanced modern weapons used against civilian infrastructure. I think it's supposed to be social commentary, but the energetic electronic soundtrack and cool special effects make it look uncomfortably entertaining. I'm getting mixed messages here. We're going to be blowing up civilian residences with all kinds of cool weapons and it's gonna be great. We have scud launchers, carpet bombing, nukes and fucking space lasers, says the game. We have to put things in context. 9/11 was 2 years ago. Americans were still more than a little crazy and less critical of their own country than they usually are. Generals is the only Command & Conquer game where the 2 main sides of the conflict, the US and China, are allies. You can say it's the first cowardly Command & Conquer game. Perhaps this was done so that Chinese gamers don't feel alienated. But again, the game was released in 2003. Chinese video game market was much smaller in size and a lot less important overall, not like it is today. And the game was eventually banned in China anyway. In the first mission for People's Liberation Army, Tiananmen Square and its surrounding areas in Beijing are devastated by terrorist nuclear weapons. In other missions, the player is made to use heavy-handed sophisticated tactics and arguably commit war crimes, although the game itself doesn't theme it like that. Another unique aspect of Generals is that while it doesn't feature Soviets or Russians at all, it nevertheless has a very obvious Commiepunk element. The Chinese faction carries the torch, so to speak. Their super heavy 2-cannon Overlord tank is superior to any other armored unit in the game. The Overlord can be equipped with one of the 3 mutually exclusive upgrades. A Gatling cannon is effective against both infantry and aircraft. A propaganda tower heals and emboldens nearby units. A battle bunker can be mounted on top of the turret. It can hold up to 5 soldiers. They can fire their weapons from inside the tank. The game's expansion, 0 Hour, features an even further improved version of the tank called the Emperor Overlord. To facilitate the spread of communist propaganda, the vehicle now comes with a pre-installed speaker tower. In addition to that, the tank can still mount an optional double Gatling turret. The game's story, or at least its ending, is skeptical of American interventionism. The US withdraws its forces from Europe to focus on terrorist threats at home. Some of the former American bases have been captured by the Global Liberation Army. The Europeans tasked China with removing the GLA from their countries. In the meantime, the Chinese assure the United Nations that their policy of casual nuke use is now a thing of the past, and the People Liberation Army would exercise more restraint in the future. The Europeans accept the Chinese proposal for a new economic and military alliance. The Eurasian Unity League effectively replaced NATO. Alexander Dugin was made Emperor of North Asia. Probably. Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 was developed by EA Los Angeles and released on October 28, 2008, 7 years after Yuri's Revenge. Moscow is in turmoil. People are demanding change. The Allied forces will soon be victorious over the Soviet war machine. Premier Alexander Romanov has fled the country. 2 men, Colonel Anatoly Cherdenko and his commanding officer General Nikolai Krukov, take a secret elevator to a laboratory beneath the Kremlin. Cherdenko reveals to his superior that he was put in charge of a top-secret project, stating that time is on their side. Do you get it? This story also involves time travel. In the secret laboratory, Dr. Zelinsky has been working on a time machine. Cherdenko, Krukov, and Zelinsky use the invention to go back to 1927, where Cherdenko erases Albert Einstein from existence with an electric handshake, in a similar way to how Einstein erased Adolf Hitler in the intro cutscene to the very first game. A callback. Without Einstein's inventions, the Allies are incapable of repelling the Soviet assault. Upon returning to the present, it is revealed that the USSR is victorious, having conquered most of Europe. And much to General's dismay, in this timeline, Cherdenko is premier, and thus his superior. But something is wrong. The Soviet bases in the eastern part of the Union are sending a distress call. It appears that all the time-traveling fuckery accidentally led to a creation of a new enemy, a technological superpower, bent on achieving its divine destiny of world conquest. This is the key change in the third game. Japan stops being isolationist and joins the Soviet-Western conflict as a third playable side. Red Alert 3 is by no means a bad game, receiving generally positive reviews from both the critics and its intended audience. But it wasn't enough to rejuvenate the public interest in the series. The gaming landscape changed a lot since the release of the original Red Alert. The age of RTS was over. The age of MOBAs has begun. In an attempt to reanimate real-time strategy, the design team implemented a co-op mode. Each faction has a fully cooperative campaign, playable with either an AI partner or with another player online, although it's not clear if this functionality is still available. I had a very authentic Red Alert 3 experience. I played the game in co-op with an American friend of mine who at the time was going through basic training in the US military. The campaign eventually gives you control over both Allied and Soviet bases, so he played the Allies while I managed the Soviet part of our army, and that felt appropriate.
Premier
Cherchenko continues to push his Soviet forces into Western Europe, seizing control of key regions left behind by the retreating Allies.
The design of units and missions was gimmicky and very silly. In the second Soviet level, the commander is tasked with securing a rocket launch pad near Moscow. The problem is that the launch pad has been abandoned for a very long time. There is a circus there now. This turns out to be a good thing because there are trained bears in the circus and we can conscript them for the Soviet cause. There are also Tesla soldiers in power armor imprisoned in the circus. We conscript them as well. After the launch pad is secured, we gain the ability to do impromptu airstrikes by dumping orbital garbage on our enemies. This ability is useful because it turns out that the Japanese were hiding inside the circus tents all this time. The mission ends after we fight a telekinetically gifted Japanese schoolgirl with our Soviet spider robots. Casting the shitty Star Trek guy as Japanese emperor was a perfect choice.
Hi, I'm George Takei, and you're watching Battlecast.
After Trump got elected, George Takei was one of those liberals who got really into race science, examining the inherent untrustworthiness of Slavic skulls and all that. So, retroactively, it kind of makes sense that he plays a character who wages war on Russians.
But my mother was a good Charleston dancer. And I thought that looked so funny, you know, all this. And particularly my mother in her 40s and 50s doing this.
I have to make a confession. I did not enjoy my time with Red Alert 3. It's impossible to get emotionally invested in this experience. The game has a bunch of unfunny jokes instead of a soul.
I'm a little bee. I can sting you.
See, the second game was also satire. Things got outright stupid in the expansion with a T-Rex devouring a Soviet time machine and all that, but Red Alert 2 was so endlessly creative with its missions, characters, and unit designs that it wasn't very hard to forgive it for the lack of verisimilitude.
He is war hero.
And things do not get better from here. Command & Conquer Red Alert Mobile was an iPhone game developed by EA Mobile Bucharest. It was released in 2009 and removed from the App Store 5 years later in 2014. I'm assuming this means it was unsuccessful. Story-wise, the game is a direct sequel to Yuri's Revenge and a prequel to the third game. It details how the Soviets managed to obtain the technology for the time machine used at the beginning of Red Alert 3. Interestingly, despite being a mobile game, it retains the core RTS mechanics of the Command & Conquer series. Opposing factions harvest resources from ore fields using collectors and then use those resources to construct military bases and forces on site. There is a legitimate technology tree and a good number of units to choose from. It's not clear if you can still legally acquire this game after its removal from the App Store. But there is a new mobile project. On Monday, April 23rd, the Chinese publishing giant Tencent announced Red Alert Online. The game is supposed to be available on both iOS and Android devices. Tencent is the world's largest gaming company, one of the world's most valuable technology companies, and one of the largest social media companies. Among other things, they are responsible for PUBG Mobile. The trailer for Red Alert Online has this strange and pleasant color correction that makes everything look too dark and red. Not thematically consistent with the second or third game or their expansions. The iconic apocalypse tanks make a return. In the end, we see the Psychor villain Yuri saying something menacingly. That's cringe. As of the moment of writing, the game doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Doesn't seem like EA wants to advertise the product of their partnership with Tencent. And maybe that's smart. Command & Conquer fansite cncnz.com published a comprehensive report detailing many instances of open plagiarism by Tencent. For one, they stole the lovable likeness of Commander Stukov, who is one of the key characters in StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft II by Blizzard Entertainment. You can see him in the top right corner in this screenshot. On another screenshot, we can spot a different unit from StarCraft II, AH-G26 Banshee, that first appeared in Wings of Liberty campaign. On yet another screenshot, we see a siege tank, plagiarized from the same game. The vehicle seen just behind Yuri's right shoulder in the game's promo art is a Scud launcher. The design was borrowed from a fan-made modification for Red Alert 2 called Mental Omega, which has been in production since 2005, for almost 15 years. On some of the screenshots, you can clearly see that Red Army soldiers are actually Space Marines, specifically the Blood Angels chapter from Warhammer 40k series. From innovating strategy games and inventing new aesthetic styles to stealing visual concepts from Blizzard Entertainment, who in turn stole them from Games Workshop. A sad ending to once legendary series.
It is a tragedy.
Over the decades, the American-Soviet cultural struggle experienced several flashpoints. One of these battlefields was the interpretation of the events of World War II. Both nations would of course inflate their own importance. Although, to be fair, the Soviet story is much closer to reality. After all, they did most of the fighting and most of the sacrificing. But Americans were, without a doubt, the real winners of the war. Their nation wasn't destroyed. They didn't suffer catastrophic demographic losses. American aviation and ground forces went from obsolete and unimpressive in the beginning of the conflict to the best or second best in the world by the end of the war, and the price they paid for all this in terms of human life was relatively small. The space race and the associated accomplishments are an endless source of pride for both nations. The moon landing was admittedly more technologically impressive, but at the same time, you can't be the second first nation in space. Another flashpoint, both in cultural and in military terms, was the Soviet-Afghan War. Between 562,000 and 2 million civilians were killed. Combine that number with very high casualties among the Mujahideen, and it turns out the Soviets killed up to 1/7 of the country's population. In addition to that, millions of people were forced to flee Afghanistan as refugees. Essentially, the Soviets committed a textbook genocide. And the thing about genocides, the reason why some large-scale tragedies are considered to be genocides and others for seemingly arbitrary reasons are not, is because in some of these cases, people and organizations have actively worked to promote awareness of these tragedies, while in other cases no such work was done. There are two reasons why the Soviets managed to get away with it. The fact that they didn't allow foreign journalists into the war zone certainly helped. The Afghan war happened just before the digital age. Information was much easier to control. But another reason has to do with American insecurities. The memory of the Vietnam War was still alive, still haunting, still embarrassing. American politicians were too eager to frame the failure of the Soviet war effort as their own Vietnam. It wasn't. The Soviets lost around 14,500 people dead. Their main opponents, the Mujahideen, lost anywhere from 57 to 90,000. The Vietnam War lasted twice as long, and almost 60,000 American soldiers lost their lives. In an attempt to humiliate the Soviets, Americans ended up accidentally absolving them of their crimes. There is a number of curious experimental Soviet vehicles that were developed in the Afghan war period that can be described as real-life Red Alert. I haven't seen these in games yet. The 1K-17 Zhatia is a self-propelled laser vehicle, a laser tank. The platform uses a Msta-S chassis with a battery of projectors mounted in the turret. The function of the laser weapon is disabling the optical electronic equipment of enemy missiles, ground and aerial vehicles. A similar laser system was developed around the same time named Sangvin, which was based on ZSU T34 Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. In Russian military terminology, these are somewhat pretentiously named quantum battle lasers. The Soviet laser pistol was a prototype energy weapon designed for cosmonauts. The weapon was magazine-fed and used pyrotechnic flash bulb technology to project its beam. There is a different version of this weapon that was a revolver design. The space laser pistols were meant to disable optical sensors on enemy spacecraft. There are examples of Commiepunk found outside of the Red Alert series. Battlezone is a curious hybrid of a first-person shooter and a real-time strategy game developed and published by Activision in 1998. A remake of the arcade game by the same name that bears no resemblance to the original. The game is set during the turn of the 1970s with an alternative history plot in which the moon landing and the space race were in fact government conspiracies used to cover up the deployment of the United States and Soviet militaries into space. The game has two single-player campaigns, one following the American National Space Defense Force, NSDF, and the other a much shorter one with the Soviet Cosmos Colonist Army, CCA. The NSDF and CCA battle all across the solar system while searching for mysterious alien artifacts. These relics belong to the long-dead alien race called the Chthonians, who visited Earth on several occasions, influencing Greek mythology. One of the relics obtained by the Americans is stolen by a scientist defecting to the Soviets. The player must hijack a Soviet moon fighter and tap into their communications network, which reveals the Cosmos Colonist Army have relocated their main base to Saturn's moon Titan. With the knowledge provided by the artifacts, the Soviets began manufacturing weapons based on the alien technology, powerful levitating machines called the Furies. But it turns out the Furies are self-aware and are programmed to destroy all life. They turn on their Soviet masters, attacking both human factions. Eventually, the Space Americans and the Space Russians unite against the awakened alien threat. Communist moon tanks and SDF Mars walkers fight side by side. The main Fury base is destroyed and the machines are defeated. There is a sequel. Like the first game, Battlezone 2 is a cult classic. Modernized version is available on Steam, but it has no Commiepunk elements since both nations are now working together.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
Good evening. I'm Colonel Bradwell, and this is ACN News. The Coalition's signing of the Balma Treaty will end decades of colonial conflict. Coalition dignitaries will be arriving on Jupiter's moon Europa to take part in this historic event. All over the solar system, Alliance fleets are standing down. The Eastern Coalition, headed by Admiral Kulak, is just now arriving to take part in the signing of the treaty.
Welcome, Admiral Kulak. This is Base Kennedy Patrol. We are ready to escort you to the surface.
Lions, fools. Commander Romanov, commence the attack.
Da, Admiral. Senior Lieutenant, signal the battle group to decloak.
Starlancer is a sci-fi space action game released in the year 2000. Back then, these were called space simulators. It was created by Chris Roberts of Wing Commander and Star Citizen fame under the auspices of Digital Anvil Game Development Company. It is the year 2160. Mankind has colonized the solar system and two political entities have emerged. The Alliance, consisting of American, Australian, French, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, British and German forces, essentially the space, not NATO, and the coalition of Russians, Chinese, and other foreigners, which are basically the space, not Warsaw Pact. Low-intensity conflict between these two entities has been going on for years. The game begins with a bloodbath. The Coalition deploys its fleet of stealth fighters for a surprise attack on Alliance assets. All of the inner four planets, including Terra herself, are quickly overrun.
Vice-Admiral Petrov reports the French and Italian fleets have been destroyed. He's requesting additional ships to house the prisoners.
Execute them all. We have no time for prisoners.
The surviving Alliance warships regroup at Neptune's moon Triton and attempt to regain lost territory. The player takes the role of a rookie pilot in the International 45th Volunteers Squadron, which seems to be inspired by real-life First American Volunteer Group of the Chinese Air Force, more popularly known as the Flying Tigers. Starlancer offers an interesting twist on Commiepunk. The Eastern Coalition includes not only the Russians and the Chinese, but also African and Middle Eastern nationalities who have their own elite fighter squadrons and specific tactics. Neo-Islamo-Bolshevism arrives from the future. Russian squadrons and capital ships are still the main antagonists. Russian names are often misspelled both in the game and in the manual. In fact, misspellings are so common that I first assumed it was an intentional stylistic choice. It probably wasn't. That's funny. The developers of a space sim didn't know how to spell Gagarin. Fucking boomers. Boomer genocide in space, best day in my life. The game's depiction of retrofuturistic evolution of Soviet technology is spot on. The Coalition interceptors sort of look like science fiction versions of Soviet Hind helicopters, although the lag fighters in Starlancer don't much resemble real-life lags.
At last, we now get the chance to face each other in combat.
I'll pick up two Coalition torp bombers, backed up by two wings of lags, jumping in.
That's Commiepunk as hell. The Eastern Coalition's signature weapon are not its fighters or warships. The most dangerous thing on the field are these Kamov torpedo bombers. They have cloaking devices, sophisticated electronics, forward-firing guns, and their torpedoes can absolutely annihilate capital ships. This is probably the reason why the Space NATO loses the war eventually. This leads to the chronological sequel, Freelancer, a somewhat better-known space trading combat sim/shooter. It was released in 2003 and features absolutely no Commiepunk elements whatsoever. The events of Freelancer take place 800 years after the first game. Facing defeat, the Alliance placed some of its people in stasis and sent them to the Sirius system, where they settled and transformed the surrounding space, the Sirius sector, into a new human civilization, free of communism, where instead they would fight each other and shape-shifting aliens. You know, I'm beginning to think Chris Roberts might be a crypto-Maoist third-worldist. It makes sense if you think about it. Starlancer is a game where a coalition of Asians, Africans, and Middle Easterners, spearheaded by a Russian warship with a name that roughly translates as a farting man, defeats the white Western Europeans and sends them fleeing to another corner of the galaxy. Just like it is the case with the Red Alert series, Russians themselves, in their own art and pop culture, were not actually arrogant enough to portray this level of triumphalism. Unfortunately, neither Starlancer or Freelancer were commercially successful. Both games sold way below expectations. Poor performance can be explained as a part of a trend of falling sales for space flight simulators and the wider flight simulator genre in the early 2000s. The genre sort of temporarily died back then, and it was dead for more than a decade, until its relatively recent resurgence. That's one of the reasons why Star Citizen got its nostalgia box.
Welcome back, Grisha. Oh, how was recruit training? Boring. Ha, but necessary, Comrade Sergeant. Those recruits will soon be needed. Товарищи! It's good to see you all here today. And it will be even better to see you soon breaking through that wall. Then we'll teach those NATO dogs how to fight. They thought they could bully us into submission. They thought we'd give way and fall. But today, we'll show them that the Red Army bows to no one! Today, we'll show them the might of the Soviet Union!
Now that is what they call big dick energy. World in Conflict is a 2007 real-time strategy game developed by the Swedish studio Massive Entertainment. The game's story takes place in an alternate 1989, in which an impending economic collapse and a failure to achieve aid via diplomatic means leads the Soviet Union to invading Western Europe, triggering World War III. The premise is very Tom Clancy-esque, but the actual game, and especially its expansion, are smarter and more creative. The single-player story sees players assume the role of a United States Army officer who takes command of battalions of US and NATO forces combating a surprise invasion of the United States from Seattle, Washington, as well as operations in France, Russia, and New York. We can observe American soldiers selflessly defending their country at the Battle of Burger King. In a March 2009 expansion pack, World in Conflict Soviet Assault, players assume the role of a Soviet military officer who commands Soviet forces in Europe, Russia, and the United States. The expansion opens with a very cool Red Alert-esque intro cutscene that showcases various Soviet technologies and military know-hows. Later in the same cutscene, we see an Ekranoplan, that's exotic tech. An Ekranoplan, or a wing ship, is a relatively little-known vehicle type pioneered by the USSR. It is designed to attain sustained flight over a level surface, usually over the sea, by making use of ground effect, the aerodynamic interaction between the wings and the surface. The vehicle is typically intended to operate from water like a flying boat, but some can operate over any flat area such as frozen lakes or flat plains, similar to a hovercraft. If you are confused by any of this, think of these machines as basically really fast boats that look like airplanes and travel at aircraft speeds. Caspian Sea Monster was an experimental Ekranoplan developed in the Soviet Union in the 60s by the Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau. It began operation in 1966 and was extensively tested by the Navy until 1980, when it was damaged in an accident and sank in the Caspian Sea. Despite technically being an aircraft, it was considered to be closer to a boat and was assigned to the fleet, but operated by test pilots of the Soviet Air Forces. The secret Soviet KM project was discovered by the United States in 1967, when photographs taken from spy satellites showed the plane taxiing during testing near Kaspiysk. The strange aircraft puzzled intelligence agencies in the West. Its small, stubby wings didn't seem appropriate for its large size. The KM markings, what do they mean? And why does it have a flag of the Soviet Navy on its fuselage? The United States Central Intelligence Agency branded the aircraft the Caspian Monster after the KM markings, while in reality it actually stood for Korabl Maquette, which means ship prototype in Russian. The model shown in the game's cutscene is Lun class. Equipped for anti-surface warfare, it was armed with the P-270 Moskit-guided missiles. 6 missile launchers were mounted in pairs on the dorsal surface of its fuselage, with advanced tracking systems mounted in its nose and tail. Another version of Lun was planned to be used as a mobile field hospital for rapid deployment to any ocean or coastal location. It was named Spasatel, or Rescuer. Work on the project was about 90% done when the military funding ended and it had to be abandoned. The only model of this class ever built entered service with the Black Sea Fleet in 1987. It was retired in the late 1990s. Unlike Westwood, the Swedish company actually did some research into the Soviet military culture. The game's aesthetic is a lot more realistic compared to the Red Alert series, and yet the presence of experimental and esoteric Soviet technology unmistakably grounds it in Commiepunk. Retrofuturistic fetishization of the communist aesthetic seemed to have went out of fashion about a decade ago. You might have noticed that we didn't have a new Red Alert or similar games for some time now. This can be explained by two things. For one, there is, or there was, a lack of interest in anything Soviet. This makes sense. The Cold War was a long time ago. People no longer find these aesthetics relatable. Another issue is that real-time strategy genre as a whole experienced a dramatic decline. These old franchises are not as culturally significant for the contemporary gamer as they were for the previous generation. There are relatively few real-time strategy games released each year. And while I don't think the traditional CNC-style RTSs are coming back, the obsession with communism might. There are studies, like this Pew study, that show that both millennials and Zoomers are heavily left-leaning. American political culture seems to be moving leftwards. Perhaps this will lead to a renewed interest in Commiepunk. Westwood, the innovators and the inventors of real-time strategy genre, were bought by Electronic Arts in 1998. In January 2003, it was announced that Westwood, alongside EA Pacific, would be merged into EA Los Angeles. The studio closed in March that year. EA is a devourer and a destroyer of creative companies, and over the years it had many victims. Origin Systems was the name of the company the based spaceship man Chris Roberts worked for. The firm was responsible for Wing Commander, Crusader, and Ultima series, as well as other innovative games. They were purchased by EA in 1992 and shut down in 2004. Bullfrog Productions, another legendary studio, was responsible for Theme Park, Magic Carpet, Syndicate, and Dungeon Keeper games. It was founded in 1987 by Peter Molyneux, bought by EA in January 1995, and shut down in 2001. Famous RPG developer BioWare was bought by Electronic Arts in 2007. It is not completely clear if it was EA that ruined BioWare, or did they do it themselves. The original Command & Conquer game is getting a remaster, but there are reasons to be skeptical. It was one of the most important childhood games for me, but it's hard to see the remaster doing well. The mechanical complexity just isn't there. Tactical puzzles that were a challenge for 10-year-old me would be boring for adult me today. And the game's narrative was never very captivating. It's the opposite of the problem with StarCraft Remaster. That game can never be truly successful because of its mechanical complexity. The original Command & Conquer cannot be successful because of its simplicity. Commiepunk remains a testament to American creativity and imagination, to their ability to create a more fun Soviet aesthetic than the actual Soviets did. The closest thing Russians have to Commiepunk is a genre of pulp fiction called accidental travel. It usually involves a plot device when an ordinary person finds himself outside of their normal place and time. Like a Russian soldier from a modern day somehow travels through time to 1941 and uses his knowledge of the future to become Stalin's best general and prevent the early war catastrophe. I suppose this is somewhat Red Alert-like. These spawned a huge genre of revanchist alternative history mixed with science fiction that used to be, and still is, very popular in Russia. But that is a story for another time.
To you, comrade. The people want to meet their new premier. The future is yours, Commander. The future is yours.